I can't even see the fine print on that. How am I sounding? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So this might be a little difficult. Well, you want to hook this maybe to the back of me?
Sure, yeah.
Just put it on the collar or something?
Yeah.
Should there. Ta-da! Am I loud enough?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. And this also advances as well as points?
It did.
Okay, cool.
When I did it, it made like the computer error noise. If it does that, are you okay with just hitting the space bar?
Sure.
Okay. I didn't know how to fix it. It only did it like every few times.
Odd.
So if it does that, space bar always works.
Spacebar does work. I'm down with spacebar.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cowgill.
Cowgill.
Yeah, spelled Cowgill, pronounced
Yeah,
Cowgill.
I also
Yeah,
I want
no,
to-
yeah. I've given up correcting people. It's fine either way.
Good morning. Welcome to the Saturday morning science. It's also very good to see so many friends here. Most of you guys come from biological science. I'm a professor of biological science here. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Libby Cowgill. And she's a native of California, but now she's more Missouri than California. And she actually got her bachelor degree UC Berkeley with the highest distinction in anthropology. Then she found her way to Missouri, St. Louis, and did her both MA and also PhD anthropology in WashU. And following this, she was a faculty briefly at the University of Central Florida. Then we are lucky to have her now on our faculty. And obviously, tradition is going to tell you some very cool topics, but I want to introduce something else. She's going to have a movie, a PBS and documentary on the same topic to be aired in 4 days.
Yeah, the 17th.
17th.
PBS, so
on PBS. So that'd be very cool. She has also have a book in press on the same topic, which has come up presumably this year, okay, in press. So she's very highly accomplished in this particular area. I also want to only add one note. She also won the 2016 Provost Outstanding Junior Faculty Teaching Award. So she clearly highly accomplished not only in research, but also teaching as well. So I would like to ask you, welcome her again to give this fantastic topic. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming. Believe it or not, it's really easy to keep undergraduates enthralled with Neanderthals. Go figure, right? Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Neanderthals and sort of the history of their discovery and interpretation and how that's changed over the years. Neanderthals as a group have sort of been capturing our collective imagination for about 150 years at this point. They were one of the very, very first human fossil species ever discovered. And we have quite a few of them now. And so you can kind of actually watch their interpretations change and shift over time, which is one of the main themes of today's talk, right? Sometimes those interpretations have changed because we have new evidence or new approaches or new analyses that have sort of changed the face of science. Sometimes I think they change just because of political and social climate, right? So you can sort of watch our opinions on them fluctuate with our opinions on ourselves, like some crazy funhouse mirror reflection of humanity. So I'll be talking about the various interpretations. They've gone from being sort of bent-kneed, hairy, brutish barbarians, right? This is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal from a French newspaper from around 1911, to well-shaved New Yorkers in bowler hats, to happy, hippie flower children of the 1970s. These days, they're socially oppressed proponents of auto insurance, right? But I'm gonna kind of divide this talk into a couple of pieces. We're gonna talk very briefly about the historical context, right? So when we found the first Neanderthals, what we thought of them then, to give you sort of a brief background on the starting point of where we came from here. Where they went, we'll touch on that at the end because that's something everybody generally wants to know. One of the hottest topics in paleoanthropology is, of course, what happened to Neanderthals. Somewhere around 30,000 years ago, poof, they're pretty much gone, okay? And so their exact evolutionary fate is something we've been grappling with for a really long time. And then woven in through all of this is who they were as humans, which is kind of my own particular area of interest. I work on sort of Neanderthal growth and development. I work on Neanderthal activities over the course of their lifetime. So inside this kind of general introduction to Neanderthals, I've sort of woven some of my own research. And I'll be telling you a little bit about, hopefully, what we can say about what their lives were like as humans. So back to the beginning, right? This was in 1848, the first or second debatable Neanderthal ever actually found. This is the Gibraltar skull. And when it was found, it actually wasn't recognized as anything special. They thought it was a weird-looking human, and it ended up in a museum. But later on, it would be the very first and actually the very only human fossil that Charles Darwin ever saw. Right? We know he saw it because we have little bits and pieces of his letters. Both Lyell and Faulkner called on me, and I was very glad to see them. Faulkner brought me the wonderful Gibraltar skull. And that is all Chuck said, right? Didn't give any other opinions on it. The only fossil that he ever saw, and we have about 2 lines. the first Neanderthal to actually make a big splash, though. The first one to be recognized as something unique and different at the time that it was actually discovered is this guy right here. This is the type specimen. It's found in the Neander Valley in Germany. And it was found by miners that were blowing out limestone. Okay? So they found this, recognized that it might have been something weird, took it to a local school teacher, who then went and took it to a local college professor. And together, these two introduced it to the scientific community as a human ancestor. Once you get familiar with the history of human paleoanthropology, you realize that this almost never goes well, particularly back in the 1800s, right? It wasn't warmly received, and that was mostly because of this man here. This is Rudolf Virchow. He was a very famous German pathologist, and he, of course, seeing the Neanderthal specimen, didn't think that it was a human ancestor. He thought it was a very sick human. When all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Here was his interpretation. It was a Russian soldier that came through Germany to attack France. It had bow legs because of riding. It had rickets, which is a nutritional deficiency that causes further bowing of your arms and legs. And it had brow ridges because of excessive use of the forehead muscles. Right? This sounds silly to us, but people believed him. I mean, the man had his own stamp, right? He was pretty influential at the time, okay? Well, not everybody believed him. One guy called bunk on this. This is Thomas Huxley. Some of you may know him. He was famously nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog because he kind of didn't tolerate idiots very well and was known for his very acerbic wit. Here's what he had to say. Given a rickety child with a bad habit of frowning, say from the internal flatulent disturbances to which such children are especially liable, and the result will be Neanderthal man. The Neanderthal man was nothing but a rickety, bow-legged, frowning Cossack who, having carefully divested himself of his arms, accoutrements, and clothes, no traces of which were found, crept into a cave to die. Now, if you can't hear the sarcasm dripping off that, you weren't listening, right? But the damage was already done, okay? This begins the period of what I affectionately call Neander slander. So this is around this time, around 1864, a gentleman named William King named Neanderthals as a new species. And this is a great example of what I'm talking about when I say that our own biases and social milieu of a time gets sort of integrated into our science. Here's William King's logic on why Neanderthals were a separate species. The skull cap looked like primitive, uncivilized races. Primitive, uncivilized races had no concept of God. Therefore, Neanderthals lived in a moral darkness and must have been a different species. When you do science on humans, it can get complicated. I guarantee you, this is not how we name new species of frog, okay? But shortly after, this was published in a French newspaper, right? So we've already had this idea that Neanderthals are these not yet human, primitive, brutish creatures. Okay, so what do we know now, all right? Where did Neanderthals come from? Somewhere around 1 million years ago, a little earlier than that, populations left Africa and moved out into Asia and Europe across the globe, okay? The populations that moved into Europe stayed there, settled in, and slowly over time started evolving into the group that we now call Neanderthals. So this is the general range where Neanderthals lived. So as you might imagine, that beginning date, 250,000 years ago when they first appear, that's a little fuzzy because populations were evolving for 1 million years in there. So where you want to draw that line of when the first Neanderthals were Neanderthal enough to call them Neanderthal, It's sort of up to you. What is not fuzzy is that end date, 28,000 years ago. That's the last Neanderthal that we ever see. After that point, Neanderthal populations throughout this entire region are replaced with people who essentially look just like you and me, so anatomically modern humans. What do they look like? Okay, brief rundown. There is a modern human skull there and a Neanderthal skull there. If you notice, the cranium is basically the same size in both of those. So Neanderthals had brain sizes that were on par with modern humans, maybe even a little bit larger in some cases. But the shape of the head itself is a little bit different, right? We've got kind of a soccer ball shape going on here. Neanderthals have this long, low, globular shape that's sort of angled in the back, right? Their faces would have looked a little weird too. The best way that I can describe what a Neanderthal face would look like is if your face was made of rubber and I stuck 2 fingers up your nose and just pulled your whole center face forward. So right along the midline, the whole thing would be sort of projecting with these swept back cheekbones. It would have looked sort of odd. On top of that, they would have had a really, really large, prominent nose. So that would have changed a lot of the way their face looked to us. And then, of course, you can see here, fairly prominent brow ridge development and no chin to speak of. Right? Chins actually come really, really late in human evolution. In anatomy, we call the chin the mental eminence because only really, really smart critters like Homo sapiens get them. Give you a little rundown on some things that are sort of interesting and unusual about them. Their teeth are sort of odd. So what you're looking at here, this is the upper jaw. So you're looking at the maxilla of a Native American, okay? And a very young one at that, right? So that's the wisdom tooth, and that's barely coming in, right? So this is a young adult. And what you can see here is all these kind of little bits of dark, right? That's dentin, okay? So that's the spots on this individual's tooth where they've worn through the enamel and kind of entered into the secondary layer of the tooth, the slightly softer surface of the tooth. That is the upper jaw of a Native American that is a little bit older. And what you can see here is pretty much all the cusps are lost. All this kind of creamy yellow in here, that's all dentin. So that individual has completely worn down most of the cusps on their teeth. And this is super duper common for non-urban, non-industrial populations. These days we get a little bit of grit in our Happy Meal and we call a lawyer, but most of human history is characterized by this really high level of wear on our teeth. That said, this is what you looked like if you were a young Neanderthal. Particularly pay attention here to these front teeth. You can see kind of in the center there's a little bit of, I don't know, like a flying saucer shaped coloration there. You can see it there and there. That's the pulp cavity, the cavity inside the tooth that holds the blood vessels and the nerves, right? What that would have felt like to have it exposed to the world, I'm not entirely sure, right? This is what you looked like if you made it to your early 20s. Here's what you looked like if you were fortunate enough to be a 40-year-old Neanderthal. Right? I love this close-up here. This is a tooth where they've basically just chewed all the way down to the entire tooth being worn off. They're essentially munching on a root at that point. Right? Very, very high degree of wear. And the wear isn't always 100% normal. So when we look at them, a lot of them have front teeth that have this really unusual angled wear on it, a type of wear that isn't really typically caused by just eating things. Hopefully your mother told you to never use your teeth as tools, because this is apparently what Neanderthals were doing. They were using their front teeth as sort of a third hand to hold on to things while they were processing them. We know that because there are several different populations, Inuits for one, alive today that still do this type of holding on to things, particularly hides with their front teeth, and they have almost identical patterns of wear to Neanderthals. We know a little bit about the rest of their body as well. A couple of things. We know that they were very, very muscular. And we also know that they were what we call cold adapted, so that their bodies were very well adapted to living in colder glacial environments. So the muscularity part is one of the things that I've worked on quite a bit over the course of my career. So I work on how the body, and particularly how the skeleton, responds to exercise. And with Neanderthals, we can use these techniques to basically draw conclusions about what they were doing over the course of their lifespan. So bone essentially is just like muscle. The more you do, the more your body lays down bone in response to that. And the less you do, the more of a couch potato you are, the more bone is taken away. Okay? And once you know that as sort of a basic guiding principle, you can look at all sorts of different skeletal populations and draw conclusions about, were they super active while they were alive, right? What sort of weapons did they use? Sometimes even what sorts of food processing did they engage in? A great example of how this is used is that you, pretty much everybody in this room, unless you're some sort of competitive athlete, have about 5 to 15% difference in the amount of bone you have in these two bones here. These are your upper arm bones, your humeri, right? So if you made a section through the center and then carefully measured how much bone were in each of those cross sections, you'd find that your right arm was 5 to 15% larger than your left arm, just from a lifetime of doing unilateral activities, preferentially using that arm. The only populations that are higher than that are people like tennis players, right? People who have been training since childhood doing one-armed activities, right? Tennis players and Neanderthals. So Neanderthals have about a 50% difference between their arms, some are up or near 100% difference. And you basically don't even need to measure with them. I think you can all kind of see, just by looking at it, the difference in thickness between the right arm and the left arm. Now, what does that mean? Why would they have that? We'll come back to that a little bit later. We also know that they were very well adapted to living in the cold. There are a couple principles that govern thermoregulation in all animals across the globe. One of the things that we've known for a long time from looking at different critters, particularly critters like bears and foxes, things that are well distributed over large gradients of climate, is that if you live in a colder climate, typically you have a larger body size, a larger body mass. You also typically, in a colder climate, tend to have shorter limbs, shorter tails, smaller ears, if you're an animal, right? Because what you're trying to do is minimize the amount of surface area you've got for heat to escape through, okay? The opposite holds that if you are an animal that is well adapted to living in a desert. You tend to be small, light, have long limbs, big ears, lots of surface area for heat to escape through. I always explain this to my students with breakfast pastries. No, it really works, guys. If you take 1 cup and make pancakes and 1 cup of batter and make waffles, what gets cold faster? Waffles, more surface area, thereby answering the age-old question of why your butter never melts on your waffles. Right? And of course, what holds for waffles holds for everybody else too. If you look at bears, the largest bears are, of course, polar bears. Slightly smaller are grizzly bears. Temperate climate bears, like American black bears, are smaller than that. And a lot of the variation in human body form is actually explained by these general principles. So If you look at people, indigenous people, and look at their body shapes, you'll see that individuals like this Inuit lady living in very cold climates tend to be fairly stocky with very short limbs, whereas individuals living closer to the equator tend to be narrower with smaller body masses and longer limbs, better able to disperse heat. Now, what does this have to do with Neanderthals? Well, they were very stocky. They were Inuits taken to like the nth degree. Super wide bodies, super short limbs, particularly when you put them next to early modern humans. So later on, I'll tell you a little bit more about this, but we know that the first modern humans also probably evolved in Africa and then spread out over the rest of the globe. We now have confirmed this from a variety of different genetic studies, but people have known this from long, long before we had access to genetics. And how did they know? They looked at the first modern humans in Europe and saw that they were shaped like equatorial Africans. It was a pretty good sign that they'd come from somewhere else. One of the other things we know about Neanderthals is that their lives were very, very difficult. This is one of my favorites. This is a Neanderthal from France. His name is La Chapelle-en-Sang. We affectionately named this guy, people call him the old man of La Chapelle, right? As you can see, hopefully you don't need to be an osteologist to know that the lower jaw is not supposed to look like that. This guy has pretty much lost everything but about 3 or 4 teeth. And then the bone, following that use it or lose it principle I told you about a little bit earlier, has basically resorbed in response to not having any teeth in there. The fact that they call him the old man of La Chapelle is particularly interesting when, based on our best abilities to determine it, he's probably about 30. The rest of his body shows all the signs of wear and tear as well. This is a hip joint. These are toes. All these little bony spicules that you're kind of seeing hanging on to the edge of the acetabulum there, or the hip joint, that's osteoarthritis. That's just wear and tear on the body. This blob here is what's called a bone callus. So if you break a bone, your body throws down a whole bunch of additional bone at that fracture site, trying to knit it back together again. We see both of these things all over Neanderthals. Lots of fractures, lots of arthritis. Yeah, again, you don't need a whole lot of anatomy experience to know that's not what an upper arm is supposed to look like, right? This is, of course, again, the humerus, right? So that's a left humerus, and that sad thing there that is about 400% smaller than the opposite arm is the other humerus. Very, very clearly, completely atrophied. People think that this is the first Paleolithic amputation. This individual was found fairly complete, so we have a lot of the skeleton except for the arm below the elbow. And by amputation, I don't mean surgically removed. It seems likely that it was a traumatic amputation, that this guy survived having, not to be too graphic, his arm ripped off at the elbow at some point. And then lived for quite a long period of time, right? Because the bone remodeled in response to not being used. All Neanderthals have this super, super high level of injury. And we've been interested in this for a really long period of time and trying to figure out the explanation for why you see this really high level of fractures on Neanderthal remains. This is a famous study. This was done by my former advisor, a guy out at WashU named Eric Trinkhaus. And what he did was tally up all the injuries that we see in Neanderthals by region of the body, okay? So head injuries, trunk injuries, arm injuries, hand injuries, pelvis, leg, and foot, and then went around kind of comparing them to different populations, right? So if you go into your average hospital setting, get a bunch of hospital records, tally up the area where regular people end up having fractures, how does that compare to Neanderthals? What he was trying to do was get some idea of what particular activities might these people have been doing in order to get this level and particularly this pattern of injuries. As you can see here, clinical sample doesn't really match up all that well, but he kept looking until he finally found a sample that matched a little bit better. Right. There's Neanderthals versus rodeo riders. Okay, what does this mean? I actually just presented a paper on this, reanalyzing this data, and there are several problems with it, but the argument that he's making here is not that, say, Neanderthals were riding the bucking broncos of the Pleistocene, right? But the argument that he made from this was that maybe this was a population that was in very close contact with large wild animals. And this totally jives with everything we know from archaeology about the way that they probably hunted. We think that they were doing something called ambush hunting. We find occasionally beautiful things like this. This is a 7-foot long spear, right? They've tried to throw this thing. It doesn't fly very well. Pretty much the way that it is best used is handheld. And so they think what these individuals were doing was ambushing game. So essentially, sneaking up on a large, angry animal and poking it with a sharp, pointy stick, which is not the safest way to procure groceries, okay? This might possibly explain this really high level of injury. And you know what else it explains a little bit? The difference in the level of strength between their arms, right? If you're holding one of these big, long, heavy spears and have to continually use that back arm to jab it into an animal, that's one of those things that's really going to build up arm strength on one side. So how do we interpret these really high levels of injuries, right? People have been thinking about this for a long time. Well, you can think of it as life was tough, right? Obviously, it was not a cakewalk to be a Neanderthal. Things were difficult, okay? But here's the flip side, right? And you got to think about it this way too. You can also think of it as Neanderthals were tough, all right? So if I break your arm and then I kill you and I bury you in my backyard and someone digs you up 1,000,000 years from now, right? They're not going to be able to tell that I broke your arm right before I killed you. Because at that point, his remains will have been trampled by buffalo, houses will build, they'll be pretty fractured and fragmented to begin with. The only way we can see these injuries, see them in a scientific sense, detect them, is because Neanderthals survived them, went on to lay down that bone callus, that little blob of bone to try and repair it, so we can see the healing process. So when I say maybe Neanderthals were tough, maybe we're seeing this really high level of injury because for the first time in human history, people are surviving stuff like this. They're actually living through traumatic amputations, right? And why might that be? Well, a lot of people have used this type of evidence to draw conclusions about social caring, right? If you don't have a tooth in your head, if you have your arm ripped off in a highly mobile hunting and gathering society, and there's no one around to look after you, you don't fare so well, okay? So perhaps this high level of injuries is not only life was hard, but Neanderthals themselves were also very hard, but also a little soft, right? Tender and caring. So times are changing, right? Once you get up into the 1950s, you start getting things like this, right? This is sort of a more loving interpretation of a Neanderthal. This is out of a textbook. If he could be reincarnated and placed in a New York subway, provided that he were bathed, shaved, and dressed in modern clothing, it would be doubtful whether he would attract any more attention than some of the other denizens. I think this says more about New Yorkers than it does about Neanderthals, but maybe I'm wrong, right? But you can see sort of the changing face here, right? As time would go on, this would change further. This is a very, very famous burial, reconstruction of a famous burial. from Iraq, a place called Shanidar Cave. And when this was first excavated, one of the things that they found in the actual burial was pollen. Okay, so at the time, and it still gets frequently repeated, the interpretation was that this was an individual that was buried with a bouquet of flowers. Okay, well, much to the disappointment of hippies everywhere, it also looks like rodents were burrowing their way through these deposits and dragging bits and pieces of grain that they were eating and taking to their nests. And that is probably the most likely explanation of how that pollen got there. Right? That is not to say that Neanderthals didn't bury their dead, because they did. We know that mostly because this is the first time we find super complete skeletons, right? So prior to Neanderthals, you find one or two really complete skeletons in the human fossil record. Those happen to be skeletons that were just fortuitously buried rapidly after they died. Because for the most part, if you leave a dead body out in the open, it's not conducive to forming a fossil, right? It gets eaten, it gets trampled, it doesn't actually end up in the fossil record. The fact that we have so many of them that are basically complete is pretty good evidence that they were all being rapidly buried after they died. But here's the problem. So as humans, when we find someone that's buried, all right, and when we think about burial, we have all this symbolic meaning that gets added to that, right? Humans bury loved ones for a variety of different reasons, to say goodbye as part of religious beliefs, right? So when we see some other species burying their dead, we tend to assume those very same motivations. With Neanderthals, there's no real reason to assume that. We have absolutely no evidence, no good evidence, of Neanderthals actually being buried with anything symbolic. They didn't put grave goods in there, right? They basically just dug a hole and put a dead guy in. And there's a lot of very practical reasons for doing that. If you're living in a Pleistocene landscape, maybe you just don't want a dead guy rotting in your cave, okay? This is a landscape where things like woolly mammoths, cave lions, cave bears, all sorts of things that are not found in Europe today were still running around, would be very interested in a dead body, right? So we also have to think in terms of the practical implications of why this might have happened. Sometimes they buried Uncle Bob, sometimes they ate Uncle Bob. We also have a variety of different sites that seem to show pretty clear evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism. So these are a collection of Neanderthal bones that have cut marks on them, here and here. This is a femur, the largest, strongest bone in the human body. It has big sort of dents on it where it's been hit with a stone. Why would they do that? Yeah, delicious, delicious meat butter. Go for the marrow, which is very nutritious and high in calories. What they weren't doing is this. So this is my favorite burial that I've ever worked on. These are actually modern human children. They're modern human children that date to around 26, 27,000 years ago. They're from Russia, okay? One of them is about 9, the other one's about 13, and they're buried head to head. They were buried with 10,000 hand-carved ivory beads that were probably sewn onto clothing that they were wearing at the time of their death. They have these big, giant mammoth spears. They're buried with a variety of small horse carvings. The older child has a belt that has 250 different fox teeth strung on it. Right? In a stroke of absolute total weirdness, that right there is a third individual. That is the femur of an adult individual that has been chopped off at each end And the inside, the marrow cavity, was stuffed with ochre, which is a red pigment, and then put in the burial with these two. I don't know what that means, because that's symbolism, right? This is exactly what Neanderthals weren't doing, right? This complete attention to symbolic detail of the horses and the beads, right? These were individuals that were buried in a ritualized fashion. So, as I mentioned, around 30,000 years ago, faces that looked like this are completely replaced with faces that look like this. This is Cro-Magnon, one of the earliest modern humans in Europe. Now, if you noticed, I said earlier in the talk that modern humans moved out of Europe around 40,000 years ago, and that Neanderthals didn't disappear fully until 30,000 years ago, which means that there was about 10,000 years of contact, or at least possible hypothetical contact, between these two populations. And what happened then? Well, that's the stuff that really bad science fiction is made of. Or at least it was until the last couple of years, right? So recently we've been speculating on, what was this contact like? Did they kill each other? Did they interbreed? What happened when a Neanderthal saw a modern human in Europe? And with the advent of genomic research, we're actually starting to get a much better grip on that. So they have sequenced all the DNA of a Neanderthal at this point. And they did sort of a pretty skillful, elegant analysis, in my opinion. That's actually pretty easy for everyone to intuitively understand, which you can't, of course, say about a lot of genetic research. They took the entire genome of a Neanderthal, and they compared it to the genomes of European people, African people, and Asian people. Okay? So if Neanderthals and modern humans interbred in the past, who would you expect that to have the most similarity to the Neanderthal genome? Europeans. Yeah, because that would be the people that they would be interbreeding with. And lo and behold, that is exactly what they found, right? That Europeans have genes that are much more similar to Neanderthals than either Asians or Africans do. So you can see sort of the changing face of Neanderthals, right? They've gone from being sort of these sort of short, brutish, bestial kind of critters to actually being us, right? Because if Neanderthals can interbreed with us, right? If you guys took high school biology, you know that the ability to interbreed is often one of the ways that researchers define a species, right? So they've gone all the way from being something totally different to actually being humans and very, very human-like. I always like to end by telling kind of a funny story. When I was in graduate school, my advisor, the gentleman who was responsible for that study on the rodeo riders, came into the lab one day and he said, "You know what, Libby? Neanderthals are our mirror of Erised." And being a graduate student, you always think that you know nothing and your advisor knows everything. So as soon as he left, I panicked. I thought it was some profound reference to like Greek mythology that I didn't know, or what had I missed? For those of you who don't know, the mirror of Erised is the mirror in Harry Potter. Well, Dumbledore shows you whatever your heart most desires. Dumbledore looks and sees a nice pair of woolen socks. What he was saying is that Neanderthals have basically served as a reflection of us throughout the entire 150 years that we've been studying them. And I wasn't missing some profound reference. It's good to know. Thanks for listening, guys.
All right, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you, Libby.
Hi, could you
17th. Oh.
could you talk a
Movie
little
going
bit
to be aired?
Right, we have two people talking at me at once. I'll answer his because it's real quick. He's asking when the documentary is coming out. It's on PBS on the 17th at 9 p.m.
Could you talk a little bit more about why they disappeared? Because it sounds like if they were interacting with Homo sapiens, that there would either have to be some kind of conflict or something else, particularly if they were breeding with them. It would be interesting to know what you think about why they suddenly died out.
So, you could, we don't actually know, okay? That's the first answer. But there are other ways for conflict to occur other than direct, like, I'm going to stab you conflict, of which we have very little evidence, right? They could have simply outcompeted Neanderthals in an evolutionary sense, right? So, been two species, both competing for the same set of resources, right? And then through, increased fertility and increased hunting technology, basically just outcompeted Neanderthals. And that seems a lot more likely to me than, rampant warfare, okay? We know, and I could talk for another hour on what we know about early modern humans, but their weaponry and their technology is miles advanced over what Neanderthals were using, okay? We did know that they interbred. We also have some evidence that there was cultural contact, right? So throughout almost all of the period of time where you see Neanderthals, they're not doing anything symbolic, as I mentioned. They're not making art. They're not decorating themselves. They're not making jewelry, except all the way at the very end. They start doing some things like hanging teeth on cords. And you can see that they've perforated these teeth so that they can wear them as jewelry. This is something they didn't do for 250,000 years. And it's very coincidental that all of a sudden they happen to start doing it when modern humans arise on the scene. So it's almost like they saw modern humans doing these things and started copying them. So there was genetic contact, there was cultural contact. We don't have any evidence that they were like slaughtering them en masse, but also that's a really hard thing to see in the fossil record. As I mentioned, if you don't heal from something, right, sometimes it's really hard to detect the type of injuries that killed you that happened right around the time of your death. So I'm afraid all we can actually do on that front is speculate. Yeah.
Kind of along that line, to what extent could that sudden disappearance actually be explained by just lack of a fossil record during that period? Or we just don't have any more fossils of them rather than they've actually disappeared?
That seems really unlikely to me. And the reason is because we had so many of them all the way through. So I tell people that there are probably about 500 Neanderthal fossils. So we have a lot of them. So in order for that to be plausible for me, there would have to be some reason why in the fossil record Neanderthals just stopped fossilizing and modern humans started fossilizing. I don't really have a great reason for why that would be.
The migration maps always seem to show, whether for Neanderthals or sapiens, everything going north to Europe and then branching out. Is there some Eurocentrism there? Because didn't they go to South Africa too?
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, so there are a variety of different, that's massively simplified. There wouldn't be one migration, there would be multiple migrations. There would be people going from East Africa to South Africa, people going to South Africa to East Africa, people going probably from Asia into the Middle East, people going all over.
So it is Eurocentrism then.
I call it public talk centrism. How about that? I like to make it simple and make kind of a nice story. Yeah.
I have a question about the bones. I think the example you showed, it seemed like the Neanderthal was left-handed. Like a thicker bone on the left side or something? Like
right-handed.
Oh, was it right?
It was right-handed. All Neanderthals are right-handed. That's a weird thing, huh?
Well,
we don't have a single left-handed Neanderthal. Yep, not a one. Now, They're not, okay, so 500 fossils, you have to keep in mind that that's not 500 complete skeletons. But we do have multiple humeri and multiple pairs of humeri, and they're all right.
So what's the normal? What would be our 10% on, let's
10% is correct. However, we don't always fully know whether that 10%, it's actually hard to figure out whether that 10% is a natural 10% or a forced 10%, because our world is a right-hand world, right? So we kind of make kids become right-handed. It's somewhere between 10 and people have speculated upwards to maybe 20% if we didn't force everybody to be right-handed. But yeah, they're all righties, and we don't know why. We have a few left-handed early humans.
So I was wondering about the distribution of early humans' injuries compared to that of Neanderthals. You talked about modern humans versus Neanderthals.
So yeah, I could go on for it. So I actually mentioned, I love this story, okay? I love the story of they look like rodeo riders. But I actually got together with a graduate student and reran. So when Eric originally did this, he just compared the Neanderthals to the clinical population, an archaeological population, and then to rodeo riders. And so my thought was, well, that was in 1994. Maybe if we compared them to a whole bunch more of populations of known activity patterns, we would find that not only are they comparable to rodeo riders, but they're also comparable to gymnasts or something like that, and that would enhance our picture. Eric's not very happy with me right now. Unfortunately, what we found was that the Neanderthals are also very similar to injuries from golf carts, from diving, from water tubing. There are a variety of different physical activities that match very, very well with the patterns seen in Neanderthals that don't make any sense. And so what I actually think is that most of that pattern that we see in Neanderthals is an artifact of what we call taphonomy and preservation. So if you noticed, Neanderthals have this absurdly high level of head injuries. Well, as it turns out, for most of the history of paleoanthropology, we found a lot of heads. People have been really interested in collecting heads. So if most of your skeletal sample is heads, then of course you're going to have a lot of head injuries. So in answer to your question, modern humans look the early modern humans look very, very similar to Neanderthals, because we also liked their heads too.
Hey, Libby.
Hi, Kevin.
What's the thought on the brow ridges and sort of low skull shape? Is that present in juvenile Neanderthals, or is it something that sort of develops with the kind of functional use of the head?
So I said, like when I was actually first introducing it, the very first Neanderthal ever found is a little tiny Belgian baby called Angie. And the brow ridges aren't there, but the long, low shape is too. And it's obviously, it becomes more enhanced over the lifetime of the individual, obviously, but a lot of the main features, like brow ridges and the midfacial prognostism and all the things that we associate with Neanderthal cranial morphology, are still there in the babies. Yep.
Was there any evidence found of like musical instruments with Neanderthals, or were they strictly like a survivalist culture?
Yeah, good question. There's one very famous, if you look this up on the internet, there's one thing that comes up as the Neanderthal flute, okay? It's not actually a Neanderthal flute. It looks like a flute. It's a chunk of bone, bare bone, with little holes in it. Flute-ish, right? Again, though, what it actually looks like happened was, so it's a juvenile bear bone. When bears hibernate for the first time, often baby bears don't make it because they don't have enough fat on them to actually survive the hibernation. And adult bears, upon waking up and finding a nice dead baby bear there, eat it. And so what it looks like, it's a baby bear bone that has holes punctured in it from the teeth of an adult bear eating it. The first actual musical instruments don't come around until around 25,000 years ago or so with modern humans, and they're really cool. They are flutes. They're made mostly of bird bones. The one I'm thinking of is made of a swan radius, and it's beautiful. They've actually reconstructed the sounds, the music that you can play on it, and it sounds fabulous. They've got a guy out there who's making bird radius flutes and playing them, and he actually makes pretty good music. You can find it on the internet.
All right, if there are no more questions, we'll have another round of applause for our speaker.
Thanks. That was fun. Yeah. I like giving that talk.
It's no lefty. That's interesting.
No lefties. Yeah, everybody liked that one. Could you please unhook me? It's driving me crazy. It got all tangled in my hair.
What?
I don't know why. Yeah, it just got hooked up in my hair.
It's long.